Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I'm going
Wonderful. Thank you.
Now, I'm going to make 3 points today only, and that is first of all about public space in the past and how it's changing now. Second point will be about sculpture within the space, and I give you 3 examples. One, the People's Theatre, is transitional space. The second one is a piece of sculpture in a street called Lambert, which is a fortuitous space. It happened by chance, really. And the third example is a sculpture called The Starting Point of the Silk Road, and it is a logically chosen space. And my third point is about a different group of sculptures in a place called Tang Mall in the city of Xi'an, and this is to do with creating a new kind of public space. So, to start off, just to see where Xi'an is, in the middle of China, entirely landlocked. It was the capital of the Tang dynasty, which is basically 7th to 8th century. And here is the city of Xi'an, as you see it now. This is the central part. The wall surrounding the city here, this is the Ming dynasty wall, so approximately 14th century. The Tang city was much, much larger. The Tang city 1,000 years ago had a 36-kilometer perimeter wall. This is about 4 kilometers along here, 3 kilometers along here. So the overall characteristic that you see in these Chinese cities is directionality. It runs north at the top, south, west, grid pattern, very strongly imposed grid pattern. And the overall impression you get because of this, right up until 1949, the Communist Revolution, was really one of walls. You have obviously the perimeter wall, but each little ward would also be enclosed by walls. So what you saw in a Chinese city was walls within walls within walls. And this means that you don't have, traditionally, public space. It simply wasn't there. Now, if we go to the next picture, this is the outer wall, so you can see the size of it, and this is the North Gate house up here. Outside the city, we have the first inner ring road. Now, walls within walls. Here you see what is the mosque here, and you see it is entirely enclosed by a wall. That wall may be decorated by carving on the outside, but you don't see inside at all. This, again, looks as if it's old, was entirely rebuilt in the 1980s. Okay, so another thing you will notice about Xi'an is that there is almost nothing remaining from the past. It's almost all post-1949, and in fact mostly sort of post-1960s. Now, the way the city was divided, which I think is important to remember, is that, oops, sorry, we're going the wrong way. Up. The city was divided. This part, the south longitudinal sector, was where the Chinese population lived. This part was the Muslim city, and this part, from here up, was the Manchu city. And the most important things that you have in Xi'an as the characteristic, the selling point of the city today, are the heritage from the Silk Road and from the Tang dynasty. And one small point to make, just in passing almost, all of the sculpture which you see in public spaces in the city of Xi'an has been approved by the city government. There is nothing that is privately privately sponsored. So, if we go back to the walls theme, we have walls, and you see walls like this. They go on building walls all the time. And the next one. The other problem that you have in Xi'an is the demolition, the changing. So you see, this is up in the northeast sector of the city, vast areas empty, even within the main city. And this kind of scene, this is right in the middle of town. What they're demolishing is 1970s buildings and 1960s buildings. And consequently, it's a changing face of the city all the time. And this is another one. Now, the way you create public space, open space within the city, therefore, is by demolition. And everything you see there, the green area, that was all housing. And you can see here, it's the bell tower. Now that was, again, 15th century building, but has been very much rebuilt over the centuries successively. And this, the Xi'an shopping mall, has changed the grid pattern of the city here. So it's set at an angle instead of facing north or west, as it should. But another point about this open space, it looks nice, but then you realize that it's conceived in such a way that people cannot group together. There are only these small alleys where you can walk. This is the kind of space where you're not meant to be in a crowd. So it prevents public meetings. Now, from here, I'm going to go on to my 3 examples of sculpture in public space. And the first example, 1953, the People's Theatre. This was the very first building in the city to be conceived with sculpture as part of the overall design. You can see at this point they're still very much influenced by the Russians. You can just see one piece of sculpture here at the entrance, and there's another one just here. Now this is really a transitional building because you see there is no real wall in front. You can walk straight in, you can see the building from the street. So what would have been a completely enclosed courtyard is now an open courtyard, but the sculpture is against the wall. It's not in space. So here you have a kind of transition. Traditionally you might see guardian figures at the entrance to a temple. These are a bit like guardian figures, but as it is in the early days of the communist rule in China, what you have are heroic workers inviting the masses into the theatre. And that's the pair on the right, and we have the other pair on the left. So you have agricultural workers and industrial workers. So here you have a kind of transitional space where it's partly on the old Chinese model but interpreted for a modern, different use. Now, my next example, here you have the map of the area around the drum tower. This is the drum tower. There you have then is the street leading north out of it. And along here, this is the Muslim market. This is in the Muslim part of town, and the entrance to the market is here. And this is a small, fortuitous space. The building line was moved back at some point. You can see here it's in 1991. Since 1991, all of this has been demolished. This has all been rebuilt. This is, I mean, everything has been rebuilt, in fact, but this is rebuilt without taking account of the original building plan. Now, what we have here in this little space is a space which is small, which is protected. You feel at ease. You have an entrance from the north, from the west, from the south, protected by the drum tower here. It's a very secure space, and what's been put in here is this. Now here you have traditional figures of Xi'an ordinary people. So this figure here, the man squatting on the bench eating from a large bowl, is a sort of folklore type in local history. This is a water seller, this is a woman selling eggs, and there's a child just there. Now, it's very difficult to get this photograph because usually what you see is that. It's amazingly popular with people. It's endlessly photographed, used as a background for people having their portraits taken. And it's very approachable. And this is partly because of the size of the space and partly because of the size of the sculpture. And it's also to do with ordinary people. You see the man here is wearing a Muslim-style hat, which you still see people wearing in the area. Now, for me, this is not so much sculpture as street theatre. Everybody's interacting with it all the time. And so I've left aside the question of aesthetics, what kind of sculpture is this? Figurative sculpture, obviously. But in terms of reception, it works very well. And partly why it works so well is the space is so good. Now, my third example is a sculpture produced by Professor Mark Eichel, and he was Dean of the Faculty of the Fine Art Academy in Xi'an, and he made a small-scale sculpture of the Silk Road, which was then seen by somebody at the city government who decided that they would like to make it big, and they decided where to put it, and that is west of the old city, outside the city wall, about 2 kilometers out. It's on a road which leads, obviously it leads west, it's facing west, as the Silk Road should be, but too far out of the city, and it is effectively in the middle of a major highway. So on each side of this longitudinal park you have traffic, and there is no pedestrian crossing. It's almost impossible to get there. So even though this is a sculpture which I think would be very popular in another area, here you see it's almost deserted. There's hardly anybody who ever goes there. But when people do manage to get through, you do find that it's, again, well received by people in terms of using it. Now, we come to my final point, and that is creating an entirely new kind of space. Now, in the southeast of Xi'an, there is an area which is Qijianlu district, and this has been designated as a culture and residential district. Here you see the Great Wild Goose Pagoda, which has been there more or less in the same position since the Tang Dynasty, and it has been completely redesigned by this Nikkei Sekkei group, opened in about 2006. This is the south end of it, and you can see cars go down here and down here, and all the way up the middle you have 1.2 kilometers of sculpture. Now, all of these sculptures are based on Tang Dynasty figures. So you have Tang Dynasty emperors, you have philosophers, poets, etc., etc. And all the building on either side is in a kind of neo-Tang style. You see with curved roofs here. It's what they call the neo-Tang. The south end of it now looks like this. You see the brackets on top of these pillars are more or less in the sort of Chinese style, but here they're completely useless. They're not holding up a roof. But all of these pillars light up at night. There's a light show. Okay. Now, this is one example of this more than a kilometre long sculpture show. This is the Empress Wu Zetian and her retinue. her servants surrounding her, you can see that here the important thing in terms of space is this entirely dominates the space on either side where pedestrians are meant to walk. It's fenced off, you can't get close to it. It's bigger than you are, and it's very, very oppressive. So here's a detail of that. You see the Empress with her servant holding the umbrella over her. Now, the problem with this is, creating a new public space, but it's a public space which is really quite hostile. And it's part of the branding of the city. So, just to finish off with, you'll see Tang Dynasty ceramics. This is very, very common theme in the ceramics, a camel with the camel rider. And what you see in town is this kind of thing. So what they're doing is, first of all, creating different spaces, many different kinds of spaces, but also imprinting a saleable image of the city by these sculptures. Thank you very much.